The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the quiet neighborhood houses like a warning signal no one expected to see. Police cars lined the street, neighbors stood on their porches whispering, and right in the middle of it all stood Karen, the woman who had spent years acting like she owned the entire neighborhood. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the power she thought she had was about to disappear. It all started an hour earlier when Karen called the police, claiming that someone in the neighborhood was breaking law rules and causing serious disturbances. She sounded confident, almost excited, like she had finally caught someone doing something wrong. That someone was me. At least, that's what she thought. Karen had spent months trying to make my life miserable. Parking complaints, noise complaints, fake rule violations. She wrote letters, filed reports, and even threatened legal action. Every time something small happened in the neighborhood, she somehow blamed me. But tonight, she went too far. Instead of sending another complaint, Karen demanded a police raid. Yes, an actual police raid. She claimed there were illegal activities happening in my home and insisted the police come immediately. The officers arrived expecting something serious. They searched, checked documents, and looked around carefully. And found absolutely nothing. The silence that followed was almost painful. Neighbors watched from their driveways while Karen's confident smile slowly faded. The officers exchanged looks, clearly realizing they had been called out for nothing. One officer finally turned to Karen and asked the question everyone was thinking. "Ma'am, do you have any real evidence?" Karen froze. Her voice, once loud and confident, suddenly sounded unsure. She tried to explain that she was protecting the community, that the law rules gave her authority, that she was simply doing her duty. But the officers weren't impressed. Instead of arresting anyone, they started writing something down. Karen didn't notice it at first. But when the officer finished writing and handed her the paper, her face turned pale. It wasn't a warning. It was a citation. Calling the police without evidence. Filing a false report. And that was only the beginning of her problems. Because what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the situation she had created was about to bring her somewhere she never expected to be. A courtroom. And when that day came, the person sitting in the judge's chair would be the very person she had spent months trying to destroy. Me. The moment she realized that truth would be the moment everything changed. But before that moment arrived, Karen was about to learn that power, pride, and lies always come with consequences. And her consequences were only just beginning. The night of the police raid should have been the moment Karen realized she had gone too far. For most people, a citation from the police would have been enough to stop, apologize, and quietly disappear from the situation. But Karen was not most people. Instead of admitting her mistake, she doubled down. The very next morning, the neighborhood woke up to a new message posted on the WA community board. Karen claimed the police had simply misunderstood the situation. According to her, she had been acting in the best interest of the community. She wrote that she would continue to enforce WA rules, no matter what. Neighbors began whispering. Some of them had supported Karen in the past, believing she was just strict about rules. But the police raid had shaken their confidence. Watching officers search a house only to find nothing had made people question everything. Still, Karen refused to back down. Over the next few days she filed more complaints, parking violations, trash placement, lawn height reports. She seemed determined to prove she still controlled the neighborhood. But this time, something was different. People weren't listening anymore. The neighbors who once nodded politely at Karen's warnings now avoided her. Some even removed themselves from WA meetings entirely. The mood in the neighborhood was changing, and Karen could feel it. That made her even more aggressive. One afternoon she marched up to my driveway holding a clipboard full of printed documents. Her expression was tight, her voice sharp. "You think this is over?" she snapped. I stayed calm. Karen waved the papers in front of me like they were weapons. "I'm filing formal legal complaints now," she continued. "The WA board will take this to court if necessary." Her confidence seemed forced, like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. What she didn't know was that the process she was threatening had already started moving in a direction she didn't expect. The police citation she received wasn't just a minor issue. Filing a false report triggered a legal review. Paperwork had been sent, statements had been recorded, and eventually, a court hearing was scheduled. When Karen received the notice in the mail, she thought it was exactly what she wanted. Finally, she believed the legal system would prove she was right. Neighbors heard about the court date within hours. Some were curious, some were nervous, and a few quietly hoped that someone would finally stop Karen's endless complaints. Meanwhile, Karen prepared for the hearing with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to win. She rehearsed her arguments, she organized her documents, she even told several neighbors that the court would confirm her authority as wale leader. But there was one detail Karen still didn't know. The judge assigned to the case had already reviewed the file, and when the hearing date arrived, Karen would walk into that courtroom expecting victory, only to discover that the person presiding over the case was someone she already knew very well. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a strange tension hanging in the air. For Karen, it felt like the day she would finally prove she had been right all along. She dressed carefully, choosing a sharp suit that made her look confident and authoritative. In her hands was a thick folder filled with printed law rules, complaint reports, and photographs she believed would support her claims. To Karen, this wasn't just a court appearance. It was a victory waiting to happen. As she arrived at the courthouse, she walked through the doors with the same attitude she used in the neighborhood meetings, chin raised, shoulders straight, and eyes scanning the room as if she already owned it. Several neighbors had quietly come to watch the hearing. Word had spread quickly after the police raid and the citation. People were curious to see how the situation would unfold. Some whispered among themselves as Karen walked past them. Karen noticed. Instead of feeling nervous, it only strengthened her confidence. In her mind, this audience would soon witness her prove that she had been right about everything. Across the hallway, I arrived quietly. Unlike Karen, I didn't bring a large stack of documents or try to draw attention. I simply walked into the courthouse and reviewed the case file one last time. The paperwork was clear. Karen had filed a false police report, misused wale authority, and repeatedly harassed a resident without valid evidence. The office's statements were detailed, and the citation had triggered the legal hearing now scheduled for that morning. Karen didn't know any of this yet. Inside the courtroom, the seats slowly filled with observers. The quiet murmur of voices echoed against the wooden walls as people waited for the hearing to begin. Karen sat confidently at the front table, organizing her papers carefully. She occasionally glanced around the room, making sure everyone could see how prepared she was. Then the courtroom doors closed. The clerk stood and spoke the familiar words that signaled the start of the hearing. All rise. The room immediately fell silent. Karen stood up along with everyone else, still holding that confident expression. But the moment the judge entered the courtroom, something unexpected happened. Karen's expression changed. At first it was confusion, then disbelief, and finally, shock. Because the person walking toward the judge's bench, the person about to preside over the entire case, was someone Karen recognized instantly. Someone she had accused, someone she had tried to humiliate in front of the neighborhood, someone she believed she had power over. Me. The moment our eyes met across the courtroom, Karen's confident posture disappeared completely. Her hands tightened around the stack of papers she had prepared. For the first time since the entire situation began, Karen looked nervous, because now she understood something that had never crossed her mind before. The case she thought would destroy me was now in my courtroom, and the rules of the neighborhood no longer mattered. Only the law did. Karen stood frozen for a moment after realizing who was sitting at the judge's bench. The confident expression she had carried into the courtroom was gone, replaced by visible panic. Still, Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. As everyone sat down, she quickly tried to regain control of herself. She straightened the stack of papers in front of her and cleared her throat, pretending everything was normal. But the room had already noticed. Several neighbors sitting in the back exchanged quiet looks. They could see it clearly now. The woman who had always acted fearless suddenly looked unsure. I opened the case file calmly. "Let's begin," I said. The clerk read the case summary aloud. It described the false police report, the unnecessary raid, and the repeated wale complaints that had led to the hearing. Every sentence made Karen shift slightly in her chair. When the clerk finished, I looked directly at her. "Ms. Karen," I said evenly, You may present your explanation. Karen stood up quickly, almost too quickly. She lifted her folder and began speaking with forced confidence. Your Honor, she said, I was simply enforcing law regulations. My responsibility as a community leader is to protect the neighborhood. She flipped through her documents dramatically. These reports show multiple violations, she continued. Parking issues, noise disturbances, and suspicious activity. Karen spoke as if the courtroom were another HOA meeting. But the courtroom wasn't impressed. I allowed her to finish without interrupting. When she finally sat down, the room fell quiet again. Then I opened another section of the file. Thank you, I said calmly. I held up several official documents. These, I continued, are statements from the responding police officers. Karen's eyes immediately locked onto the papers. The courtroom grew even quieter. According to the office's reports, Karen had insisted there were illegal activities inside the home. She repeatedly demanded an emergency response and pressured officers to conduct a search. The officers had clearly written that no illegal activity was found. Not even a minor violation. Then came the final note. Karen had admitted she had no direct evidence. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Karen shifted again, gripping the edge of the table. This is being misunderstood, she suddenly said. Her voice was no longer confident. I was acting out of concern for the neighborhood. But the evidence told a different story. False reports waste police resources. They create unnecessary fear, and they can lead to serious legal consequences. Karen slowly realized that the documents in front of me carried far more weight than the stack of law papers she had brought. The power she once believed she had was disappearing. And the hearing had only just begun. I looked at Karen again. Ms. Karen, I said firmly. Do you have any actual evidence to support the claims you made to the police? Karen opened her mouth to respond. But no words came out. Karen stood there for several seconds without speaking. The courtroom was so quiet that even the sound of papers shifting could be heard clearly. Everyone was waiting for her answer. Finally, Karen tried to speak. Well, Your Honor, she began carefully, the evidence was based on what I believed to be suspicious activity. Her words sounded weaker than before. She flipped through her documents again, hoping to find something that would strengthen her argument. But every page she turned only made the silence in the courtroom heavier. I watched calmly. Ms. Karen, I said, belief is not the same as evidence. The statement hung in the air. Karen's shoulders tightened. She looked toward the back of the courtroom where several neighbors were sitting. Some of them had attended WA meetings where Karen had confidently accused people of breaking rules. Now those same neighbors were watching her struggle to explain herself. The clerk handed me another document from the case file. This one was even more important. It contained the official statement from the police officers who had responded to the raid. I read part of it aloud. The reporting individual repeatedly insisted illegal activity was occurring despite having no direct proof. Karen shifted uncomfortably. The report continued. Officers searched the property and found no violations, no illegal activity, and no safety concerns. Several people in the courtroom quietly murmured. Karen tried to interrupt. Your Honor, I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. But I raised my hand slightly. Please allow the report to be completed. The final section described how Karen continued pressuring officers even after they explained there was no reason for the raid. The officers had eventually determined the call was unnecessary. That decision led directly to the citation she received. Karen's confident posture had completely disappeared now. Her hands were resting flat on the table as if she needed the support. For the first time, she looked genuinely worried. I closed the document. Ms. Karen, I said calmly, the evidence shows that you made a police report without verifying the information. Karen shook her head quickly. I was acting in good faith, she insisted. But the courtroom could already see the situation clearly. WA authority allows communities to enforce certain rules. But it does not allow someone to misuse law enforcement. Calling the police without evidence can waste valuable resources and create unnecessary fear in a neighborhood. That is why the law treats false reports seriously. Karen slowly realized that the argument she had prepared for weeks was falling apart. Her WA rulebook meant very little in this courtroom. The law was the only thing that mattered here. I leaned forward slightly. Ms. Karen, I said firmly, before the court proceeds further, you have one final opportunity. Karen looked up immediately. If you have any verifiable evidence that justified the police raid, I continued, now is the time to present it. Karen stared down at her folder again. Page after page of WA rules. Complaint, letters, printed emails, but nothing that proved her claim. And everyone in the courtroom knew it. Karen slowly closed the folder in front of her. For the first time since the hearing began, she seemed completely unsure of what to do next. The stack of papers she had brought with so much confidence now looked useless. She glanced around the courtroom again. The same neighbors who once listened to her WA speeches were now watching silently. Some looked uncomfortable, others simply waited for the hearing to continue. Karen took a deep breath. Your Honor, she said carefully, I admit I may not have had direct proof at the time. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Karen quickly continued speaking. But I believed something suspicious was happening. As the WA representative, I felt it was my responsibility to report it. Her voice sounded more defensive than confident. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her statement. Reporting concerns can be responsible, I said calmly. However, making specific claims about illegal activity without evidence is another matter. Karen looked down at the table again. The distinction was clear. There is a difference between concern and accusation. The police officer's report made that difference very clear. Karen had not simply asked officers to check on the situation. She had insisted that illegal activity was happening and demanded immediate action. That decision had triggered the police raid. I opened the final section of the case file. This court must also consider the impact of that decision, I explained. False reports create serious problems. Police resources are limited, and responding to unnecessary calls can prevent officers from helping people who truly need assistance. The courtroom remained completely silent as I spoke. Karen seemed to realize something important at that moment. The hearing was no longer about neighborhood disagreements or WA rules. It was about accountability. Her shoulders dropped slightly as the reality of the situation settled in. One of the neighbors sitting in the back quietly shook his head. Others exchanged glances, remembering the many complaints Karen had filed over the past year. The pattern was becoming obvious. Karen had used her position in the WA to pressure and accuse residents repeatedly. But authority does not place someone above the law. Finally, Karen spoke again. I didn't mean for things to go this far, she said quietly. It was the first time she sounded truly uncertain. I looked at her calmly. Intent can matter, I said, but actions also carry consequences. Karen nodded slowly. For a moment, the entire courtroom felt still. Everyone understood that the hearing had reached its most important point. The evidence had been presented. The explanations had been heard. Now only one step remained. The judgment. Karen sat quietly, waiting. The same woman who once marched through the neighborhood with total confidence was now sitting in a courtroom, realizing she no longer controlled the situation. I closed the case file and looked across the room. The court will now prepare to deliver its decision. Karen's eyes widened slightly, because in that moment, she understood something she had never expected to hear. The verdict was coming, and it was coming from me. The courtroom remained completely silent as I looked down at the case file one final time. Every document, every statement, and every report had already been reviewed. The facts were clear, and the evidence left very little room for doubt. Karen sat at the front table, her hands folded tightly together. Just hours earlier she had walked into the courthouse believing she would win. She had expected the hearing to confirm her authority as the head of the HOA. Instead, she now sat quietly, waiting for the court's decision. I spoke slowly so every word could be heard clearly. Ms. Karen, the court has carefully reviewed the police reports, witness statements, and the explanation you provided today. Karen looked up immediately. Her expression showed a mixture of anxiety and hope. Even now, part of her seemed to believe the decision might somehow favor her. But the law does not rely on belief. It relies on evidence. The police officers responding to your call confirmed that no illegal activity was found, I continued. Furthermore, their reports state that you repeatedly insisted a crime was occurring despite having no direct proof. Karen's shoulders dropped slightly. Several neighbors sitting in the back row leaned forward, listening closely. For that reason, I said calmly, the court finds that the police report made by you was not supported by verifiable evidence. Karen closed her eyes briefly. The courtroom remained silent, but the decision was not finished yet. Additionally, I continued, the court has considered the pattern of repeated complaints and accusations made against a resident without substantial proof. Karen's hands tightened together. While leadership carries responsibility, it exists to maintain community standards, not to intimidate or harass residents. When authority is misused, I said, the law must intervene. Karen slowly nodded, as if she already understood what was coming next. I paused briefly before delivering the final part of the decision. Ms. Karen, this court upholds the citation issued by the responding officers for filing a false police report. A quiet reaction moved through the courtroom. Some neighbors exchanged relieved looks. Karen lowered her head slightly. But there was still one more part of the judgment. In addition, I continued, the court orders that you complete community accountability service and refrain from filing further complaints without documented evidence. Karen looked up again, surprised. The decision was firm, but it was also fair. The goal of the court was not revenge. It was accountability. Karen took a slow breath. The confident wall leader who once believed she controlled the entire neighborhood now understood something very different. Authority comes with responsibility, and when that responsibility is abused, consequences follow. I closed the file in front of me. The court's decision is final. Karen sat silently for several seconds. Then she slowly nodded. For the first time since this entire situation began, Karen had nothing left to argue. The courtroom slowly began to empty after the decision was announced. People stood quietly, whispering to each other as they walked toward the exit. The tension that had filled the room all morning was finally fading. Karen remained seated for a moment longer. The confident wall leader who once controlled every meeting and complaint in the neighborhood now looked very different. The stack of papers she had carried into court sat untouched on the table beside her. Those documents had once made her feel powerful. Now they meant nothing. Across the room, several neighbors who had attended the hearing gathered near the hallway doors. Some of them had supported Karen in the past, believing she was simply strict about following rules. But the hearing had revealed the truth. Karen hadn't been protecting the neighborhood. She had been controlling it. One neighbor quietly said something that many others were already thinking. Maybe things will finally calm down now. Outside the courthouse, the small group of neighbors slowly dispersed, returning to their cars and heading back toward the community where all of this had started. News of the court decision spread quickly. By the time people returned to the neighborhood, nearly everyone had already heard what happened. Conversations took place in driveways, front yards, and sidewalks as residents discussed the hearing. For many of them, it felt like the end of a long and exhausting chapter. The endless complaints, the surprise warnings, the feeling that someone was always watching for the smallest mistake. All of it had finally been addressed. Karen returned to the neighborhood later that afternoon. But something had changed. The same streets she once walked with confidence now felt different. People were polite, but the authority she once carried was gone. No one feared her complaints anymore. No one rushed to follow her orders. Instead, the neighborhood slowly returned to what it had been meant to be all along. A place where people lived peacefully without unnecessary conflict. Karen kept a much lower profile after that day. She attended fewer meetings and spoke far less during discussions. The experience in court had clearly changed how she approached the community. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come not from winning, but from being held accountable. As for the neighborhood, life moved forward. Children played outside again. Neighbors talked casually across fences. And the constant tension that had once hung over the community finally disappeared. Because in the end, the situation had proven
Power
something
without
important.
responsibility cannot last forever. And when the truth finally comes out, even the loudest voice in the neighborhood can suddenly become very quiet. If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.